A single Facebook post. That's all it took to dismantle Brenda Hall's 15-year career. She laughed about keeping the neighborhood clean, thinking her elite circle was a private sanctuary. But the internet doesn't keep secrets. When the chief legal officer walked into the room with a highlighter and a termination suit, Brenda realized her exclusivity just became homelessness. If you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below so you don't miss out. Brenda Hall swirled the deep red wine in her glass, the condensation cooling her palm as she sat on her back patio. It was Tuesday, just past 7, and the humid evening air was finally beginning to settle. For Brenda, this was the best part of being the regional VP for OmniCorp. The company-provided house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac where the lawns were perfectly edged and the only noise came from the occasional sprinkler. It was the kind of peace she felt she had earned after 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder. She opened Facebook on her phone, expecting the usual stream of vacation photos and filtered updates from her professional circle. Instead, her feed was dominated by a post in the local community group. A neighbor she didn't know well had shared a link about a proposed multifamily development 2 miles away, followed by a comment welcoming the changing face of the county. Brenda tightened her grip on her phone. She hated the chatter. To her, words like growth and inclusion were just code for things that would eventually lower her property value and ruin the silence of her street. She felt a surge of protective ownership over the neighborhood, even though the deed technically sat in a corporate filing cabinet at OmniCorp's headquarters. She saw herself as a gatekeeper, one of the few who truly understood what it took to keep a place respectable. In her mind, she wasn't being cruel, she was being honest. She believed she was among friends, people who worked just as hard as she did and wanted the same things. She wanted to draw a line in the sand, to signal to her peers that she stood for the old guard. She took a slow sip of wine, her eyes narrowing as she tapped the comment box. She didn't want to write a long paragraph. She wanted something punchy, something that would get a few likes from the other executives who lived nearby. Finally, a neighborhood that understands exclusivity, she typed, her thumb hovering over the screen. No urban elements or diverse disruptions here. Just us. Smirking face. She paused for a second, feeling a rush of bold empowerment. To drive the point home, she added 2 hashtags, hashtag keep it clean and hashtag no black neighbors. She hit post with a faint, satisfied smile. It felt good to say what everyone else was thinking but was too afraid to put into words. She watched the blue progress bar finish and saw her comment appear at the top of the thread. Within 30 seconds, a heart reaction popped up from a former colleague. Brenda set her phone down on the side table and leaned back, looking out over the manicured hedge that separated her yard from the next. She felt secure. She was a vice president at a multi-billion-dollar company, living in a house most people only saw in magazines. She truly believed her status made her untouchable. She finished her wine, stood up, and headed inside to sleep, never imagining that by the time she woke up, that single comment would have traveled through servers and into the inboxes of people who had the power to take it all away. To Brenda, it was just a post. To the rest of the world, it was the beginning of the end. Brenda woke up to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating against her nightstand. She ignored the first few pulses, assuming it was just the usual East Coast email chain starting early, but the sheer frequency of the pings forced her to reach for the device. When she swiped the screen, she didn't see work memos. She saw hundreds of Facebook notifications. The post she had casually tossed out the night before was no longer a quiet comment in a local thread. It had been screenshotted and shared into a public community watchdog group while she slept. From there, it had jumped to Twitter and a regional news blog. The "just us" comment she thought was a clever wink to her peers had become a lightning rod for thousands of people. The comments under the shared images weren't heart emojis, they were calls for her address, her employer's name, and her immediate removal. Across town, Sam, a 24-year-old HR analyst for OmniCorp, was scrolling through his news feed over coffee. He usually ignored local drama, but a headline about executive racism in the suburbs caught his eye. When he clicked the link, his stomach dropped. He recognized the woman in the profile picture instantly. He had processed her relocation paperwork only 6 months ago. More damningly, the house in her background wasn't just a house, it was the signature property in OmniCorp's executive housing portfolio. Sam didn't hesitate. He knew the company's zero-tolerance policy wasn't just a poster in the break room, it was a legal shield they used aggressively. He grabbed his laptop and pulled up the internal directory to confirm the match. It was Brenda Hall, Regional VP of Operations. By 7:15 a.m., he had drafted an urgent, high-priority email to his supervisor, Maria Rodriguez. He attached the screenshots, the link to the viral thread, and a copy of the morality clause from Brenda's own signed contract. In the corporate world, news like this doesn't simmer, it explodes. Maria Rodriguez saw the email at 7:20 a.m. By 7:30 a.m., she had looped in the chief legal officer. The conversation was no longer about whether Brenda was a good worker, it was about how quickly they could sever the tie before the OmniCorp logo was permanently burned into the headlines alongside her words. The firestorm Brenda had sparked with a thumbtap was now racing toward her front door, and she was still in her bathrobe, completely unaware that the professional life she spent 2 decades building was already over. The phone rang at 7:45 a.m., cutting through Brenda's morning routine. It was her executive assistant, her voice sounding tighter and more formal than usual. There were no morning pleasantries, just a blunt instruction: Brenda, leadership needs you in the main office conference room immediately. Level 4. It's urgent. Brenda hung up, feeling more annoyed than worried. She assumed a deal had hit a snag or a regional metric had dipped overnight. She adjusted her blazer, grabbed her bag, and headed to the office, still carrying the lingering confidence of someone who believed they were indispensable to the company's machinery. When she stepped into the conference room 10 minutes later, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The room was windowless and cold. There was no tray of coffee, no casual chatter about the weekend, and no welcoming smiles from her colleagues. Instead, Lucy Chen, the head of HR, and David Freeman, the chief legal officer, sat side by side at the center of the table. Their expressions were unreadable, fixed in a way that made Brenda's stomach do a slow, uncomfortable flip. Brenda started to offer a greeting, but Lucy didn't give her the chance. Without saying a word, Lucy slid a single sheet of paper across the laminate surface. It stopped directly in front of Brenda. It was a high-resolution printout of her Facebook post from the night before. Her profile picture was circled in red, and the hashtags #KeepItClean and #NoBlackNeighbors were highlighted in bright yellow. Brenda, Lucy said, her voice dropping into a flat, professional tone that offered zero room for negotiation. This post was made from a company-owned property while you were acting as a representative of OmniCorp. By identifying yourself as an executive here and using our resources to broadcast these views, you have committed a Tier 1 violation of your employment contract. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, a defensive, "It was just a joke," forming on her lips, but David Freeman cut her off before she could exhale. He didn't look angry, he looked like a man reading a technical manual. "You've breached Section 4B regarding professional conduct and Section 7A on corporate representation," David stated. Furthermore, by explicitly calling for the exclusion of a protected class while residing in corporate-owned housing, you have created a direct liability for this firm under federal fair housing guidelines. You didn't just post a comment, Brenda. You tethered this company's brand to a civil rights violation. The smugness Brenda had felt on her patio less than 12 hours ago evaporated. She looked from the paper to the two executives, realizing for the first time that they weren't there to hear her side of the story. They were there to execute a decision that had already been made. Brenda's mouth went dry, her throat tightening as she looked from the highlighted printout back to the stone-faced executives. "It was a joke," she stammered, her voice thin and lacking its usual boardroom authority. "I was just blowing off steam in a private moment with friends. It's been taken completely out of context." She tried to force a small, self-deprecating laugh, hoping to find a flicker of understanding in David Freeman's eyes, but he remained unmoved. "The impact, Brenda, is not in your intent," David Freeman said, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "The impact is in the widespread damage you've done to OmniCorp's reputation, our stock value, and our public commitment to diversity. We've spent years building a brand based on inclusion, and you dismantled it in 30 seconds. He closed the folder in front of him with a definitive thud. "As of this moment, your employment with OmniCorp is terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct." The air seemed to leave the room. Brenda gasped, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "You can't do that. I've given this company 15 years, she whispered, the panic finally rising to the surface. Then, a sharper realization hit her. My house. My home. I live in company housing. You can't just throw me out. Lucy Chen leaned forward, her expression one of cold, professional finality. Your residency at 14 Oakwood Drive is a license to occupy, and that license is explicitly tied to your status as an employee, she explained. With your termination, that license is revoked. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning to vacate the premises. Brenda began to protest, but Lucy raised a hand. Security will facilitate your departure and ensure the property is secured. Do not make this more difficult than it already is. Brenda stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't look back at the paper or the people who had just dismantled her life. As she walked out of the office, the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind her, her phone began to vibrate incessantly in her hand. She glanced down and saw a barrage of news alerts and social media tags. Her name was everywhere, tied to the word racist and fired. By the time she reached the parking lot, she was a different woman, stripped of her title, her salary, and her home, all before the morning coffee in the break room had even gone cold. The rumble of a heavy diesel engine vibrating through the front door at 8:30 a.m. was the sound of Brenda's reality finally catching up to her. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night pacing the hallways, alternating between frantic calls to lawyers who wouldn't pick up and refreshing the news articles that featured her face. When the doorbell rang, she didn't answer it. She stood in the foyer, arms crossed, watching through the sidelight as 2 uniformed security guards and a crew of 4 movers climbed out of a massive white truck. One of the guards tapped firmly on the glass. He held a clipboard with the OmniCorp logo visible at the top. Brenda didn't move until they signaled they were prepared to use the master key. When she finally opened the door, her voice was shrill, cracking with a desperation she had never felt in a boardroom. You can't do this, she told them, her eyes bloodshot. I have rights. I need more time to find a place. The guard was polite but immovable. Ms. Hall, we have the termination of license agreement here. Our instructions are to clear the property by noon. We've been instructed to be as efficient as possible. The next 3 hours were a blur of motion that Brenda couldn't stop. The movers worked with a professional, detached speed that felt like a personal insult. They didn't ask her where things should go, they simply packed. Her designer suitcases, once symbols of her high-flying executive travel, were stuffed with the expensive clothes she had bought to fit into this neighborhood. Box by box, the life she had curated, the wardrobe, the electronics, the personal files, was carried out past her and onto the driveway. Brenda followed them out, pleading with the lead mover, then screaming at the security guards to stop. She looked toward the houses across the street, hoping for an ally, but the neighborhood was eerily still. She saw a curtain flutter at the house 2 doors down, a neighbor she had once mocked for having too many kids, but no one came out to help. They just watched. They watched the woman who had bragged about exclusivity get treated like a trespasser on her own lawn. By 11:45 a.m., the house was empty. The movers didn't even put the boxes in the truck, their contract was only to remove them from the corporate asset. They stacked her entire life in a jagged mountain of cardboard and leather on the curb. The security guard handed her a final envelope, walked back inside, and she heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt engaging. He was staying inside until the locks were changed. Brenda sat down on the edge of the curb, her heels clicking against the asphalt. She was surrounded by suitcases and boxes, a fallen executive in a designer blazer sitting where the trash normally went. She realized then that she hadn't just lost a house, she had lost the shield her status provided. The world she thought she controlled had moved on without her in less than 24 hours. What happened to Brenda wasn't a random act of misfortune, it was a textbook case of what happens when personal prejudice hits the hard wall of modern corporate accountability. This wasn't about canceling a person for having an opinion, it was about the tangible consequences of violating workplace standards and basic human decency. In today's market, corporations face massive pressure and legal liabilities. They simply cannot afford to house or employ leaders who publicly endorse discriminatory views. Brenda's words didn't just offend individuals, they attacked her company's internal culture and its market value. The eviction wasn't an act of revenge, it was a swift, contractual reaction to a breach of trust. The idea that someone in power can broadcast exclusionary views without professional fallout is a dangerous delusion. Brenda's comments about urban elements weren't just a lapse in judgment, they echoed a long history of redlining and systemic racism in housing. These were the same tactics used for decades to bar families of color from building wealth and opportunity. By using coded language like diverse disruptions, she wasn't just expressing a preference, she was signaling her support for those old, exclusionary systems. In an era where every company is under the microscope for its ethical commitments, an executive's public racism is a direct threat to a firm's legal standing. Brenda's story is a reminder that in the digital age, your footprint is permanent. For those in leadership, that record is tied directly to their future. It proves that the fight for fair communities isn't just about high-level policy, it's about the everyday prejudices that, once exposed to the light, carry very real and very permanent consequences. If you found Brenda's swift downfall a satisfying reminder that actions have consequences, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into stories of corporate accountability, neighborhood justice, and the moments where prejudice finally hits a wall. Don't miss our next breakdown of real-world karmic turns that prove the internet never forgets and the truth always surfaces. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on stories that explore the intersection of social media and real-life repercussions. Subscribe now and join a community that values fairness over exclusivity.